Hello, my name is Andrew Ribera. I'm a philosopher at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels. I'm also affiliated with the Institute of Philosophy at KU Leuven. Today I'll be talking about the impact of autonomous weapon systems on military ethical thinking. This work is part of a project, the details of which can be found on some slides at the end of this presentation. Let's begin by trying to clarify the question a little bit. I want to start by focusing on the role of risk in war. In war, the opposing sides obviously seek to impose risk on each other and ultimately to inflict harm. But risk is important in an ethical sense too. According to a widely held view, it's the imposition of risk and the subsequent need to act in self-defense that licenses killing in war. So in general, in day-to-day life, killing is obviously wrong, but sometimes we think killing in self-defense is morally acceptable. And so the thought goes that, very roughly, in war, soldiers are entitled to kill enemy combatants because that killing is, in some important sense, an act of self-defense. Risk is also closely connected to the idea of developing military technology. Some military technologies aim at reducing risk to soldiers, some aim at increasing the risks posed to the enemy, and of course there's a long line of technologies and weapons that aim to reduce or increase risk in these ways. And that leads right up to today when we have autonomous weapon systems. An autonomous weapon system is one which can select and engage targets without human oversight. But in fact, I'm far less interested, in this talk at least, in the specific capabilities of these systems. I'm more interested simply in the fact that they enable a very radical reduction of risk. It's been thought that these kinds of weapons, and in recent years in the literature at least, people have particularly had military drones in mind, they enable a radical reduction in risk. The pilot and the crew of a UAV can be, at least, at almost zero risk of physical harm. There's no realistic possibility that the target could counterattack them. There in the Midwest of America, say, the target's on another continent. Now, there's obviously some sense in which drones and autonomous weapon systems are merely the latest step in a progression of technologies that progressively enable risk reduction and risk asymmetries. But many scholars have thought that the situation now has involved not merely a quantitative shift, but a qualitative one, that a boundary has been crossed. Now, in this, they draw on a fairly plausible intuition, namely that there's something inherently problematic about soldiers killing people when they are themselves at zero risk of harm. It's difficult to make exactly clear what the basis of that intuition is, or where this boundary that supposedly has been crossed actually lies, but there's at least a certain initial plausibility to that kind of claim. Part of the problem and part of the way in which these technologies of radical risk reduction can be morally disruptive is captured in a paradox that was identified and discussed by Paul Kahn. Kahn points out an inherent tension between the ideas that, on the one hand, militaries have an ethical obligation to their own personnel to reduce the risk to which they are exposed, and, on the other hand, that if they reduce that risk too fundamentally, they will undermine the legitimacy of the violence that those soldiers have to carry out. If those soldiers are not at risk of physical harm, they can hardly be said to be acting in self-defense. So what Kahn in effect points out is that either riskless warfare is not genuine warfare, and so killing under those circumstances isn't justified, or killing under those circumstances is justified, but it's justified within some other framework, not war, but perhaps a kind of policing or something like that. So that's one kind of moral disruption that technologies of radical risk reduction might provoke. It's an extreme form because it seems to imply that some uses of these technologies are something other than warfare. Well, in this talk, I'm going to assume that some uses of these technologies of radical risk reduction are morally acceptable and that they do constitute war in the normal sense. So the uses that I have in mind do involve radical risk reduction, but for example, they may not involve radical risk asymmetry. So for example, if both sides in a war have access to these weapons. Well, might there be moral disruption even in these cases? And the answer, people have thought, and I agree, is that even here there's moral disruption. But that's a little bit vague. We want to know more specifically what kind of disruption is provoked and how severe is it and what should we do about it. So to begin addressing those questions, I'm going to need to make a distinction. I want to distinguish military ethics, which was the term I used in the title of this talk, from what I'm going to call military ethical thinking. So military ethics is a field of academic study. It's the kind of ethical thinking, or it's rather a kind of thinking about ethics that academics do. And I want to distinguish that from military ethical thinking, which I take to be the kind of ethical thinking that soldiers and militaries do in the course of their activities. And I'm interested particularly in two kinds of that thinking. Decision-making by soldiers, and the training and formation that's provided to soldiers in order to support them in their decision making. That's roughly what I mean by military ethical thinking. I'm going to discuss two main competing approaches to military ethical thinking, a deontological approach and a virtue ethical approach. I want to add a couple of quick caveats here. Firstly, I'm going to discuss two approaches to military ethical thinking. But these are not the only approaches. They just happen to be the most popular and the ones that are discussed in the literature. Second, it's worth stating that most approaches to military ethical thinking are hybrid. That's to say, they combine elements from different traditions. And finally, it's of course important to note that militaries don't necessarily have an explicit commitment to some particular ethical theory or ethical approach. No, rather they have, let's say, a kind of broad and perhaps rather inchoate commitment to a certain sort of outlook. And we can say from the outside that that has some affinity with a particular philosophical tradition, but it's not necessarily an explicit commitment. The first approach to military ethical thinking that I want to discuss is the deontological approach, or as I'll mostly call it, the rules-based approach. This emphasizes the importance of duties and rules. It's part of the tradition that goes back to Immanuel Kant, most notably. It holds that, broadly speaking, the right thing to do is the action that conforms to a relevant moral norm or rule. So there's a clear contrast here, for example, with consequentialist views, which emphasize the importance not necessarily of complying with rules, but with doing what brings about the best consequences. That's an alternative view. On this view, doing the right thing is a matter of conforming with the relevant moral norms or rules. This fits well with the institution of the military. The military is very much rules-based. It's a hierarchical organization that relies on people doing what they're told, following orders and so on. But there are a few difficulties in the context of military ethical thinking. Firstly, rule following just for rule following's sake can be problematic. There can be exceptions to rules. We want people to disregard them when it's appropriate. Secondly, rules require interpretation, and interpreting a rule can be very difficult. It can be particularly difficult given that soldiers are likely to find themselves in quite complex, unexpected, novel situations. In those contexts, rules require interpretation. That's difficult. Rules can be relatively rigid, so they don't fit to the situation very well. They're not really responsive to the situation. It can be difficult to apply rules in the contexts that soldiers are likely to find themselves. Let's have a look then at the virtue ethical approach. This is an approach which emphasizes the importance of virtue and character. Right action is said to flow from the virtues, from what the virtuous person would do. The tradition goes back to classical Greece and especially to Aristotle. Aristotle said that the virtues are dispositions to respond in feeling and in action to particular situations. To be virtuous is to be able to find what Aristotle called the mean, the midpoint between excess and deficiency in relation to some virtue. So if we take courage, for example, a deficiency would be giving in to one's fears. Excess would be a sort of recklessness, a sort of inattentiveness to risk, something like that. The courageous person is the person who's able to find that midpoint between excess and deficiency across a range of circumstances. That seems like a really good fit for the kinds of military ethical thinking that we've been considering. So where we saw that rule-based approaches can seem a bit rigid, the rules don't quite fit the situations. By contrast, here on the virtue-based approach, we've got an approach to military ethical thinking that seems inherently adaptable and flexible, responsive to the situation. The virtuous person is precisely the person who's able to respond appropriately, virtuously, to the particular situations in which they find themselves. And so there it's been thought that it has a real advantage over the rules-based approach for the kind of military ethical thinking, the kind of battlefield decision-making that we've been discussing. It's generally thought that most militaries' approaches to military ethical thinking are dominated by the virtue-based approach. And so that's the status quo that I'm going to be taking for this talk. And then the idea is going to be that technologies of radical risk reduction cause moral disruption because they upset, in some sense, this virtue-based approach. I'm going to look at two kinds of potential moral disruption. I'm going to describe them. I'm going to give you some reasons to think that they might occur and that they might be severe. And then I'm also going to give you some reasons to suspect that maybe their impact is less severe. The first kind of disruption that I want to discuss is what I call revision. It's the idea that as military technologies of radical risk reduction proliferate, it will be necessary to revise our conception of the traditional martial virtues. And it might be necessary also to develop new virtues or to emphasize different ones. So the idea here is that soldiers who are fighting under conditions of radically reduced risk just don't have any need of the traditional martial virtues, such as physical courage. And by martial virtues, I mean those which are specific to soldiers at war. Here I'm going to look at some arguments from Robert Sparrow, or in fact I'm going to look at one argument from Robert Sparrow, who has argued for a form of revision. Robert Sparrow has argued that a number of martial virtues are of dwindling relevance to soldiers who operate under conditions of radically reduced risk. I'm just going to focus on one because we don't have so much time, and that's perhaps the most obvious virtue to discuss, courage. Courage involves overcoming fear, yet UAV pilots, Sparrow suggests, being located thousands of miles away from danger, have nothing to fear, and therefore they have no need of courage. How might we respond? I think the obvious point to make is that physical harm is not the only kind of harm that UAV pilots might face, and therefore physical courage is not the only kind of courage that they might have to show. So Jesse Kirkpatrick, for example, has argued that UAV pilots require moral courage. That's to say, the courage to do the right thing, even when that's very difficult. Sparrow, in reply, says that yes, soldiers may need other forms of courage, including moral courage. But, he says, these are not specifically martial kinds of courage. Here's a quotation where he makes this point. He says, while drone operators may fight wars, they do not go to war. And while they may kill people, they do not engage in combat. For this reason, the courage they display does not appear to be an especially martial courage. Well, the Sparrow-Kirkpatrick debate hits a bit of a dead end there. But what I'd like to point out is that Sparrow is here relying on the claim that UAV pilots are engaged in a very different form of activity than are battlefield soldiers. He says that UAV pilots don't engage in combat. But recall that in the introduction, I noted that we can ask the question about moral disruption, even if we accept that some uses of the technologies of radical risk reduction do constitute legitimate warfare, but they do constitute combat. So, if we accept that UAV pilots do engage in combat, then it seems that whatever kinds of courage are required to do so must be kinds of martial courage. So, in as far as the standard account of martial courage is premised on the need to overcome fear of physical harm, perhaps we need to revise it. Okay, so I'm not denying that there's a case for rethinking the virtue of courage somewhat. But it seems clear that this revision is much less severe than the one that Sparrow suggests. It does seem that courage is still relevant to soldiers who operate under conditions of radically reduced risk. The second kind of disruption that I want to discuss is what I call the rebalancing thesis. And it says that as technologies of radical risk reduction proliferate, it's necessary to rebalance the respective weights of virtue ethics and deontology in military ethical thinking so that the rules-based approach becomes dominant. The first argument for rebalancing that I want to address comes from Neil Rennick. Rennick talks about the warrior ethos, which is, roughly speaking, an account of the virtues that distinguish genuine warriors from mere purveyors of violence, and a willingness to expose oneself to physical danger has traditionally been seen as central to the warrior ethos. Yet, Rennick shows that as the warrior ethos has evolved, as it's had to respond to technologies that reduce risk in increasingly radical ways, it's come to focus less on physical courage and the acceptance of risk, and more on combat responsibility, which is a professionalism and a commitment to the rules of war, standards of war, restraint, and professional conduct. So, in effect, what it means to be a good soldier has evolved from a virtue-driven account, which was based around the acceptance of physical risk, and it's evolved into a more deontological account, a rule-based account, which is grounded on compliance with the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, and so forth. In response, I don't want to dispute Rennick's account of the warrior ethos and how it's evolved. That seems to me quite plausible and certainly very convincing the way he expresses it. What I would point out, though, is that firstly, his account is mostly descriptive in this respect, so it tells us how the ethos has developed, but not whether that development is for the best. And secondly, and more importantly, his account really only supports revision and not rebalancing, because while it tells us of the relative decline of the virtues, the ones involving physical courage, it says very little about the role of other virtues in the warrior ethos. And it doesn't say anything in particular about the relative weights of the virtue and the rule-based components therein. It's compatible with Rennick's view, at least, that rebalancing is false and that only some version of revision is correct. A more emphatic argument, in some ways, for rebalancing is provided by Markus Schulzke in a 2016 paper in the Journal of Military Ethics. Unfortunately, I don't have time to present even the rather condensed version of his argument and my response to it that are presented on these slides that I'm showing you now, but I wanted to keep the slides in just so that on the one hand you can have a look at my thoughts as they're presented on the slide, but also I think it's important to include Schulzke in the presentation because his paper really is very good, and it's, I think, one of the strongest presentations of the rebalancing thesis. Okay, let me sum up and conclude. So it does seem that technologies of radical risk reduction do cause some kind and some degree of disruption to military ethical thinking. But it's not clear, I've argued, that either of the two theses I looked at, revision or rebalancing, accurately captures this. In other work, I've argued that the disruption is actually rather minimal. And in doing so, I don't want to downplay the seriousness of the moral questions that are raised here, but rather I want to emphasize that the process of adaptation that needs to be undertaken in order that we can use these technologies responsibly is arguably less a matter of theory change than of focusing on different skills that soldiers and decision makers need. It's widely argued, for instance, that UAV pilots have greater need of virtues associated with restraint. That's a version of a revision thesis. And I agree, and to that extent I'm comfortable with endorsing a weak version of revision. But I'd suggest that such changes can be encapsulated in the ability, the skill to judge proportionality well. And that's a skill that all soldiers need. That said, soldiers who fight under conditions of radically reduced risk are clearly much better placed than their comrades on the battlefield to engage in complex moral deliberation. So we can expect higher standards of their decision making. But apart from that, we need to focus on the particular skills they need. Battlefield soldiers need to be proficient in sizing up salient factors quickly and when under pressure. Soldiers operating under conditions of radically reduced risk may have more need of proficiency in relatively detached proportionality calculations. They may have to be skilled not only in assessing proportionality for themselves, but also at assessing proportionality assessments generated by AI or other systems. Here, intellectual virtues may be as important as moral ones, though the importance of maintaining soldiers' specifically moral investment, their moral engagement in the process, is essential. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions in the question period. I'm going to flick through some final slides now which have some information about the project from which this work has been taken and some references and some further reading that may be of interest to you. Thank you.